Good evening. My name is Avinoam Patt. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. I want to thank you all for joining us here this evening for 2022 UConn Center for Judaic Studies annual Kristallnacht lecture. I want to thank all of our co-sponsors for this evening's program who have helped spread the word and encourage all of you to attend what will be a very important and I'm sure a fascinating lecture by our visiting lecturer, Professor Daniel Greene. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, the Herman and Gertrude Shepard Fund for Holocaust Education, the NEAG School of Education, the Human Rights Institute, the Department of History, American Studies, Digital Media and Design, and the UConn Humanities Institute. So I really want to thank all of our co-sponsors who have helped support tonight's program. I also want to offer a special welcome to my students from my class on the Holocaust, the Third Reich, and the Jews at New York University, where I'm serving as a visiting professor this semester. Thank you so much to my colleagues from NYU for joining us for tonight's program. In a moment, I will introduce our speaker, our distinguished speaker, Professor Daniel Greene, who will deliver this year's Kristallnacht lecture. As many of you know, tonight marks Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, or perhaps more appropriately known as the November pogrom. On this night, 84 years ago, on November 9th and 10th, the widespread wave of violence broke out across Germany, Austria, and indeed across the entire Reich. Nearly 100 Jews were killed. Hundreds of synagogues were destroyed across the Reich. 30,000 Jews were rounded up and arrested and sent to concentration camps. Thousands of Jewish-owned businesses, apartments, synagogues were ransacked across the Reich. And here you can see some images from that night of synagogues which were destroyed. I'm going to forego a lot of the historical background because I know that this is going to be part of Professor Daniel Greene's remarks this evening, but I think it's important for us to bear in mind what we are gathered here this evening to commemorate this outbreak of massive violence that took place 84 years ago. That was an attack not only on the Jewish community all over the Reich, that was a shocking outbreak of violence, but that did not take place in a vacuum. There were events that preceded it, including a widespread refugee crisis, including the expansion of the Reich, things that, as we will see in Professor Greene's and Dr. Greene's remarks this evening, were covered widely in the news. And yet, this massive outbreak of violence aroused a great deal of shock and outrage on the part of the world. Although, as we will see, this was not necessarily accompanied by a drive to action to assist the Jewish refugees who were under increasing crisis and persecution throughout the Reich. So with that little bit of context, it is really an honor for me to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Daniel Greene. Some of you may recognize Professor Dr. Danny Greene, who is featured in the recent Ken Burns PBS documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. Daniel Greene is president and librarian at the Newberry Library in Chicago and an adjunct professor of history at Northwestern University. Prior to arriving at the Newberry Library, Greene was the curator for Americans and the Holocaust, the exhibit at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which opened in 2018 in conjunction with the 25th anniversary of USHMM. He co-edited, together with Edward Phillips, the book Americans and the Holocaust, A Reader, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2022. And I should note that this volume, Americans and the Holocaust, A Reader, has garnered a great deal of praise and very positive reviews, including from Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein, the creators of the U.S. and the Holocaust documentary, who write that this book, Americans and the Holocaust, this remarkable book shatters the myth that Americans lacked information about the dangers of Nazism. These diverse historical sources from multiple voices across the United States leave us with troubling questions about the national will to respond to discrimination, war, and genocide. And Deborah Lipstadt, who also is featured extensively in the documentary The U.S. and the Holocaust, writes of the reader, Americans and the Holocaust, that the book is an important and exceptionally useful resource for the classroom. Any teacher or student who wants to get a feel for the prevailing sentiments in America during the prelude to World War II and during the war itself will be immensely aided by this important collection of voices. If you want to know what people knew and when they knew it, this collection will provide the answer. Danny Greene's first book, The Jewish Origins of Cultural Pluralism, The Menorah Association and American Diversity, was published by Indiana University Press in 2011, and it won the American Jewish Historical Society's Saul Viener Prize in 2012. So I could go on, but you're all here to hear from Danny Greene. So I'm gonna turn the screen over to you, and we're so honored to have you join us this evening. Thank you so much for being here.
Avi, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here, and always good to see you, even on a Zoom screen from afar. Thanks everyone for joining this evening. Avi really teed up many of the themes that I want to discuss with you tonight. Really trying to bust myths about what Americans knew and when they knew it, and I'm going to do that by really talking about information in the United States in the 1930s, information culture in the United States in the 1930s, and then I'm very much looking forward to hearing questions from all of you. So I am, in working as a curator, I think visually, and I'm going to show you a lot of images tonight as I talk. This is the title card, basically, for the exhibition that I curated at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Americans and the Holocaust. And you see it asks two questions. What did Americans know, and what more could have been done? The first question is easier to answer with evidence. And the second question is a little bit more of a speculative question. But the short answer to what Americans knew was a lot. Or I should at least say that Americans who were paying attention could have had access to a lot of information about the persecution and murder of Europe's Jews as it was happening. And when we began, I worked on a large team that put together this exhibition, and the Holocaust Museum in Washington said, tell us a new story. And so when someone says, tell you a new story, you need to determine, okay, well, what's the old story? And I think the old story here was, and we surveyed thousands of college students and high school students to ask them, do you think Americans had much information about the threat of Nazism as it was occurring? And a large majority of them said no. So the old story, in a way, was, well, Americans didn't know anything, so Americans didn't do anything. And we were trying to overturn that story by saying, actually, Americans could have known a lot. And that actually leaves you, and we wanted to leave visitors to the exhibition with a much more troubling question, which is, if Americans knew so much, how come more wasn't done to rescue the Jews of Europe? And this really goes back to the educational philosophy of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, which is to leave people with difficult questions, not always to tell them what to think, but to leave them with difficult questions. On the day the museum opened in April of 1993, the founding chairman of the museum, Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, said, this museum is not an answer, it's a question mark. So we were trying to ask difficult questions about this history. The approach is to ask, what did Americans knew and when they knew it? And then why rescue of Jews didn't become a priority. And so tonight I will focus on that information with a particular focus on the 84th anniversary of Kristallnacht, which was a key turning point in how Americans understood the threat of Nazism. And before I get into that, I just want to bookmark one thing, which is which I'd like you to keep on your mind as I talk tonight, which is the difference between information and understanding. There was a lot of information available to Americans about the persecution and murder of Europe's Jews. But as Deborah Lipstadt has taught us, as she says in the Ken Burns film, much of what Americans saw and read was for them beyond belief. And that the understanding of a historical event comes with hindsight. And I don't say that to apologize for American inaction, but I think it's important for us to keep in in mind that difference, the gap between information and full understanding of an event. Americans, one of the main drivers of this exhibition is to teach that Americans' response to atrocities abroad is often shaped by domestic conditions at home. If you've read Samantha Power's work, A Problem from Hell, on how Americans have responded to genocides over time, that's one of the main thrusts of that book as well. You have to understand what's happening at home to understand how Americans respond to atrocities abroad. So what's happening at home in the 1930s? Americans are a war-weary nation in the 1930s. World War I is only about 15 years in the rearview mirror. In the early 30s, the Gallup organization asked Americans many times in the 1930s, was it a mistake for the United States to enter World War I? And usually about 70% of Americans say yes. Here you see, this is a veteran on the street in Philadelphia with a sign that says, I gave my eyes. The United States is a nation that is closed to immigrants by the 1930s. We have the myth of America as a nation that welcomes immigrants, and that myth sits alongside the fact that if you watch the series, the historian Peter Hayes says in the film, keeping immigrants out has been as American as apple pie. We have restrictive immigration quotas on the books in the United States by 1924, fully 9 years before Hitler rises to power. It's a xenophobic nation in the 1920s. It's an anti-Semitic nation in the 1920s. Anti-Semitism during this period of Nazism, the 1930s and 1940s, anti-Semitism in the United States will be on the rise, not on the decline. And I'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. Again, it's a white supremacist nation. Here is the Ku Klux Klan, the second Ku Klux Klan that rises in the United States in the 19-teens and 1920s, marching outside the US Capitol. White supremacists are trying to draw boundaries around who is in and who's out in the United States. And for the Klan in the 1920s, African Americans are certainly out, Jews are out, Catholics are out. They're not full Americans. The Klan will enforce their beliefs through intimidation and through violence. It's a segregated nation. It's Jim Crow America. This is North Carolina in the 1930s. Public facilities are segregated. Schools are segregated. Churches are segregated. Neighborhoods are segregated, sometimes by law and sometimes enforced through extra-legal violence. And then in 1929, the bottom falls out of the American economy. This is a soup kitchen in my hometown of Chicago. By the time FDR Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president in 1933, 25% of working age Americans are unemployed. So I think of this as a perfect storm in the United States, an anti-Semitic, xenophobic nation, an anti-immigrant nation, a Jim Crow nation, and then a nation with horrible economic catastrophe. All of these things together are going to conspire to keep Jews out and to keep Jewish refugees out of the United States. It's not a simple explanation, it's a complex explanation. So all of these are the preconditions to 1933. And in 1933, we look abroad and we see this, right? We see a new world leader. Hitler rises to power, becomes chancellor in late January of 1933, and it will not surprise you that this is well covered in the American press, right? You have the decline of democracy in Germany and the rise of a new world leader. Of course, it's going to be covered in the American press. It's all over the American press, in newspapers, in magazines, on the radio, in newsreels. Here I'm showing you Vanity Fair magazine from November of 1932 on the left, Time magazine from March of 1933 on the right. They cover the Nazis' rise to power, and most American news outlets do not miss the fact that anti-Semitism is essential to Nazi ideology, that the Nazis explain the world in part by blaming the Jews for all the ills of Germany and the world. So one example, 1933, we're 6 months into Hitler's reign. It's July of 1933. And here's Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, on the cover of Time magazine, a very popular magazine in the United States at the time. It's hard to read what's below Goebbels' image, but it says, Minister of Propaganda Goebbels, Say it in your dreams, the Jews are to blame. There's a 3,000-word article in this issue that explains how the Nazis explain the world. The Nazis explain the world in part by blaming the Jews. Anti-Semitism is essential to Nazi ideology. You could have read about Dachau, a concentration camp that had already been set up by this point in the American press. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that in 1933, Americans should have known what was going to come by 1942 with mass murder of the Jews. The Nazis didn't know what was to come. But Americans don't miss the fact that anti-Semitism is essential to how the Nazis explain the world. So that's kind of an early moment. I really want to focus on 1938 because it is such an important turning point, as Avi said. And Avi gave us some background about Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, if you look at the 12-year period of the Nazis in power, 1933 to 1945, the event that is covered by the American news most in that 12 years is Kristallnacht. And it's covered in the United States as a shocking terrorist attack by a government against its own people. Now, the Nazis no longer consider the Jews their own people. Their citizenship had been stripped in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws, but it's an event that is covered in ways that remind me sometimes of the way that terrorism is covered in the United States today. So I could have picked headlines from any newspaper across the country. And these are front page headlines. There's been a lot of debate about historians about, is the threat of Nazism front page news often enough? Kristallnacht is front page news. And it's front page news for a couple of weeks, as I'm going to show you. So here's the Dallas Morning News, November 11th, 1938. Hysterical Nazis wreck thousands of Jewish shops, burn synagogues in wild orgy of looting and terror. This is a little bit unique because there's a photo. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda Goebbels, did not want photos of this violence to make it out into the American press, but some did. Because I'm with you in Connecticut, I decided I'll focus on some Connecticut newspapers. Here's the Hartford Courant, November 11th, so 84 years ago tomorrow. You can look towards the right of the page. Mobs burn and loot as anti-Jewish wave sweeps Nazi Germany. It wasn't only the main cities like Hartford. The Meriden Daily Journal here on the left side on November 10th, which is 84 years ago tonight, reporting 22 Jews commit suicide as Nazi mobs wreck and plunder synagogues, stores, and homes. The next day, the Meriden Daily Journal, November 11th, German Jews may be confined to ghettos under new decrees. Again, front page news. The Meriden Record that same day, it's a little smaller, but the third column over from the right. Jewish property looted and razed by Nazi crowds. Great wave of anti-Jew violence sweeps Reich. Synagogues burned, stores plundered. We're getting this news in the United States in real time. This news seems fast to Americans at the time. We should not look back. We should not make the mistake as historians of looking back and thinking, oh, those were quaint times. No one thinks they live in quaint times. This information was moving very quickly in the radio, in the newspaper, and getting to Americans almost as it was happening. So I want to pause for a moment. A key and controversial topic within Americans' response to the Holocaust is to think about how President Roosevelt responded. Here's President Roosevelt at a press conference in the Oval Office. He's sitting at his desk, and you see the press gathered around. And FDR was a master at handling the press. And these press conferences, he would have press conferences like this multiple times a week, gathered around his desk, and they were off the record. And if you quoted him, you were, as a reporter, you were not invited back. He calls the press in a couple days after Kristallnacht, and the first thing he says is, boys, and it's almost all boys, and it's almost all men in this picture, but he says, boys, this one's on the record. He wanted to be quoted in his response to Kristallnacht. And one of the things he says is, I could scarcely believe that such things could happen in a 20th century civilization. This gets covered. Here's the Meriden record on November 16th. So now we're almost a week after Kristallnacht. Again, front page news. Nazi treatment of Jews is denounced by Roosevelt as almost beyond belief. He is asked in that press conference, so are we going to let in more Jewish refugees? And he says, no, we have a quota system, right? So he speaks out and says that he's shocked by this violence. He recalls our ambassador from Germany. We're the only country in the world that does that, recalls the ambassador. It's easy to argue that that's a symbolic gesture, but I think symbolic gestures do matter for presidents. The one thing that he does is, and he's convinced of this actually by his Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, there are about 12,000 German Jews who are in the United States during Kristallnacht on what are called tourist visas. And so tourist visas have short expiration times. And FDR decides to waive the expiration date of all of those tourist visas. He actually says in the press conference, I could not in any good humanity send those people back to Germany. Now, 12,000 lives is a small number compared to 6 million. But again, we don't know what's coming yet. And that is more than a gesture to not send those 12,000 Jews back to Germany. FDR is actually at quite a weak point in his presidency in November of 1938. It's about a year after the court packing scandal where FDR had tried to add justices to the Supreme Court, which turns out to be a quite bad moment for him politically. It doesn't work. And just like this week, Kristallnacht happens the same week as the American midterms. As we know, presidents in midterms tend to lose many seats. I'll give you a sense of what happened on November 8th, 1938, just 2 days before Kristallnacht in the US elections. The Democrats lost 8 seats in the Senate. They still have a huge control of the Senate, even after these numbers are kind of mind-boggling and thinking about how divided our government is today. But even after losing 8 seats, the Democrats still hold 69 out of 96 seats in the Senate in 1938. And they lose 81 seats in the House that same week as Kristallnacht. They still hold 262 seats out of 435 after lose, but this is a bad political moment for FDR over the course of his presidency, and some people argue that that weakness, and again, this is an example of how domestic politics shapes our responses to crises abroad. A week after Kristallnacht, 40,000 Jews are reported under arrest as Nazis map new anti-Semitic decrees. Kristallnacht will be on the front pages of American headlines for 2 weeks. I'm taking you back here to Los Angeles, just because this is fully 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, November 23rd, 1938. Los Angeles Examiner, Nazis warn world Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies. So there's the news, and then there's also public opinion. And the president cares deeply about public opinion in 1938. And Gallup, Americans are here are Americans taking to the streets. This is actually Los Angeles in the aftermath of Kristallnacht too. You see Americans carrying signs, "Stop Hitler, bloody pogroms against Jews and Catholics." Gentile and Jew unite against the fascist menace. Gallup polls Americans and asks them 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? And it might not surprise you here to see that 94% of Americans disapprove of the Nazis' treatment of Jews in Germany. And so then Gallup has a follow-up question. And this is their follow-up question. Should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% say no. So this is also, these two polls, these two public opinion polls, 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, I think are really critical for understanding Americans' response to Nazism. There is a massive gap between disapproval of the Nazi treatment of Jews and a will to action on behalf of those victims. And we see that at Kristallnacht, and we see that over the next 7 years of the Nazis being in power. And in fact, in most subsequent genocides, we see that in American public opinion, a gap between disapproval and a will to action on behalf of the victims. Dorothy Thompson, this is Dorothy Thompson, who's one of the most influential journalists in the United States. She's a syndicated columnist by the 1930s in about 125 newspapers. She's got a radio show here. You see her speaking on NBC Radio. She says in 1938, it's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death. So what's she talking about here? She's talking about our very restrictive immigration quota system and how maddening it is to try to navigate the bureaucracy if you are a Jewish person from Germany who's trying to immigrate to the United States. So really what she's talking about is this. And I'm not going to read this all off, but I want to give you a sense of how difficult it was bureaucratically to acquire a visa to the United States. You needed to produce a lot of paperwork. This paperwork could be expensive. This paperwork often had short expiration dates and had to be lined up in certain orders. And you needed sponsors in the United States who were to prove that you weren't what was in the language of the day likely to become a public charge, meaning that you were going to be able to take care of yourself economically. And what I want to leave you with on this topic is how difficult that is. To leave Nazi Germany, you had to let if you were a Jew in the 1930s, you had to let the Nazis rob you of your assets. You had to list your assets so the Nazis could rob you of your assets. You were not allowed to take very much money out of Nazi Germany. Sometimes it was, say, maybe 10 marks. It varies over time. So on one side, you have to list your assets so the Nazis can rob you of your assets. And to come into the United States, you had to prove that you weren't likely to become a public charge. That's incredibly difficult. So Jews get caught in this economic vice. And this is, I think, a fascinating way to see how difficult it was. This is a map that ran in the Oakland, California Tribune in November of 1938, the same month as Kristallnacht. They're estimating that there's about 15 million Jews in the world at that time, which is a pretty good estimate. And what you're seeing here is the countries in black are Nazi-occupied, Nazi-controlled countries. And you see two numbers under each country name. On the left, you see an estimate of the number of Jews at the time in 1938 who live in that country. And these estimates actually proved to be pretty good. Poland, 3.25 million. Hungary, 444,000. Romania, 984,000. The German estimate is too high. Germany, it says 550,000. That's a good estimate for 1933, but many Jews had left Germany by 1938. Then the number to the right of the dash is the number of immigration visas that the United States could issue annually to someone born in that country. So as you move east, you see those numbers get smaller and smaller. Jewish population gets higher and higher. The number of immigration visas that we could issue, the United States State Department would issue, becomes smaller and smaller. Look at Latvia. We can issue 236 visas a year to people born in Latvia, 386 to people born in Lithuania. I'm trying to reinforce here how restrictive our immigration quotas were. We simply didn't want immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, in part because of anti-Semitism in the United States. So even if the United States government had issued all the visas that it could have under these restrictive immigration quota systems, that wouldn't have stopped the Holocaust. And yet, the United States doesn't issue the maximum number of visas that it could have every year. So these are maximum numbers, but in fact, the United States government far under issues the visas that it could have issued. And if you add up all the unused visas just for Germany in this period, you get about 200,000, right? So we could have let in 200,000 more refugees from Germany during the Nazi period. That doesn't stop the Holocaust, but it saves 200,000 more lives than we did. I want to skip ahead to 1939 then, just to focus on one more moment that shows you how restrictive these immigration quotas were. And I think I'll talk about a confluence of a couple of events in 1939, and then we can move to questions. In 1939, there is a proposal before the U.S. Congress issued by Senator Robert Wagner out of New York. Those of you from NYU should be very familiar with Wagner's name. You see Wagner's name very often on campus at NYU. And it's a joint proposal by Senator Robert Wagner from New York, and who's a Democrat, and a Republican representative from Massachusetts named Edith Norse Rogers. It gets known then as the Wagner-Rogers bill because of those two sponsors. And what that bill says is, here you see it, admission of German refugee children, although everyone in the House and Senate understood that those German refugee children would be Jewish refugees. What the bill says is, let's let in 10,000 children in 1939 and another 10,000 children in 1940. And let's not count them against this restrictive immigration quota system. One of the loudest champions of this bill is the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. She says, I think it's a wise way to do a humanitarian act. Other nations take their share of child refugees, and it seems a fair thing to do. When she's talking about other nations taking their share of child refugees, she's talking about the kinder transport. This is the moment where about 10,000 children are brought to Great Britain as unaccompanied children without their parents. The loudest voices against the Wagner-Rogers bill in the United States are Southern white Democrats, like Senator Robert Reynolds out of North Carolina. He says, my heart goes out in sympathy to the refugee children, but my heart beats in sympathy first for American sons and daughters, in preference to the children of fathers and mothers of any other nation in the world. Reynolds will play on ideas about American unemployment, right? American unemployment is still relatively high at this time, and he'll say things like 10,000 Jewish children, or those who support this position will say 10,000 Jewish children will soon be 10,000 Jewish adults. There's a lot of anti-Semitism that's hidden not so far under the surface of comments like that. And it's Reynolds that really wins the day. It's Reynolds that reflects American public opinion. Gallup polls on this in January of 1939 says it has been proposed that the government permit 10,000 refugee children. This is because it's 10,000 children a year for 2 years. It was really a proposal for 20,000 children, but permit 10,000 refugee children be brought into this country and taken into American homes. Do you approve of this plan? And again, 2/3 say no. So this is a very similar number to November of 1938, when 72% said, no, we shouldn't let in more refugees in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. Senator Reynolds eventually goes to Senator Wagner of New York, who had introduced the bill, and he says, look, let's cut a deal. You can have your bill. We'll do this bill and let in 20,000 refugee children if you agree to limit immigration or to absolute zero over the next 5 years. No immigrants entering the United States. And Wagner says, I can't take that deal. And he pulls the bill. So this bill never even makes it out of committee. It's never voted on by the United States House or the United States Senate. It dies in committee. And we have, in the United States, we have no equivalent of a kinder transport. There is no mass admission of unaccompanied refugee children at this time of such a heightened refugee crisis. The bill is dying in committee in May and June of 1939, which is the same time that this ship, the St. Louis, is sailing from Hamburg to Cuba with over 900 Jewish refugees on board who have landing permits for Cuba. They're not headed to the United States. They have Cuban landing permits that the Cuban government cancels while they're at sea. So only a few are allowed to disembark in Cuba, and the ship is turned back. The captain, a German captain who is anti-Nazi, decides to linger off the coast of Miami in the hope that these refugees will be admitted to the United States. If you watch the Ken Burns series, you might remember that one of the survivors, Saul Messenger, who is featured, talks about being on the ship and seeing the lights of Miami from the ship with his father. These are some of the refugees who are on the ship. The United States will not admit this ship. President Roosevelt says, he doesn't speak publicly about this. This is also well covered in the American press. But privately, Roosevelt again cites the quota system. He says, we have people in line for visas. How can we let these refugees jump the line? They were headed to Cuba. They weren't headed to the United States. He's also worried that if these refugees are admitted, it will set a precedent of admitting refugees who don't have their paperwork lined up to be admitted. So this ship is turned back after lingering off the coast of Miami for some days, and it's headed back to Germany. While it's at sea, a very important Jewish organization in the United States called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which is known as the Joint or the JDC, negotiates with 4 countries in Europe: France, Great Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It's still the summer of 1939. None of these countries are yet Nazi occupied. And these countries, these 4 countries, agree to take their share of these refugees. So they're not going to be sent back to Germany. And in fact, when they learn that on the ship on the way home, there's a celebration, there's a party. By 1940, some of these countries will be Nazi occupied. Of those 930 some refugees on the St. Louis, 254 are murdered during the Holocaust. But it's remarkable work by a Jewish organization in the United States to make sure that these refugees are not returned to Germany, and it's a signal also of how restrictive and closed the U.S. immigration system is in 1939. It speaks, I think, and I'll close with this. It speaks, I think, to a very important contrast in American history that we need to understand and that we see in high relief in the late 1930s. Here is a cartoon that ran in the New York Daily Mirror on June 6th of 1939 as the St. Louis was being turned back. And I know the cartoon's a little blurry. I apologize for that, but I hope you can see Lady Liberty has her head turned away. She's holding a sign that says "Keep Out." In the foreground, there's a ship, and in the smoke of the ship, it says Jewish refugee ship. So that's the St. Louis. And on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty is Emma Lazarus's famous poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, send those the tempest tossed to me," right? So this is the gap between a myth of a humanitarian, welcoming nation and the reality that often at moments of heightened crisis, it's very difficult for the United States to live up to that promise and that we tell ourselves. And I'm not saying that to say that the United States is not a nation of immigrants. It is. But the United States is both things. The United States in its history is a nation of immigrants, and it's also a nation that keeps out immigrants. And we have to struggle with that reality, that those two contradictory things can be true at the same time. And they're very true in 1938 and 1939 at a moment of heightened crisis. And there's a horrible irony here also, which is that in the spring of 1939, the US government has invested in refurbishing the Statue of Liberty. So Life magazine on the same day, which is the most popular pictorial magazine in the United States, first week of June, 1939, runs this cover, right? The beautiful Statue of Liberty. We are both things. We're this nation that keeps out immigrants, and we are a nation of immigrants. And Deborah Lipstadt makes a point in the film that I think is critically important in understanding Americans' response to the Holocaust. When the United States could have done the most to help Jews in Europe in the 1930s, and especially in this moment of refugee crisis between 1938 and before Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, when the United States enters the war after being attacked in Hawaii by Japan. Once we're at war, it becomes much more difficult for refugees to cross the Atlantic. And we are then fighting a war against Nazism, but not fighting a war to rescue Jews. And I'm happy to say more about that during the question and answer. But one of the tragedies about this history is we could do the most before mass murder had began and before we understood that mass murder was beginning. We learned, the American press covers mass murder by late 1942. But by that moment, when we know mass murder is happening, it's really too late for Americans to help by letting in refugees. And the only way we can help is by going abroad to defeat fascism, which we do. And many Americans at home and abroad make huge sacrifices to defeat fascism. But we never have that moment where we can let in a mass of Jewish refugees. So I will leave it there. Again, I'm so happy and honored to be invited to deliver this lecture on the anniversary of Kristallnacht. And I hope this helps you understand Americans' response to that event and to the threat of Nazism at the time. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen while we do that.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Danny. I'm gonna join you side by side here on the screen. We can't be in the same room, but at least we can be on the same screen. So first, please, I'd like to have everybody join me in a virtual round of applause for really what was a excellent and very provocative presentation, and provocative both in terms of the content, but also thought-provoking in terms of raising some difficult questions, which I'm sure folks will have many questions. And I'd like to remind everyone to please feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. There's already questions coming in, and I will gather the questions, Danny, and pose them to you as we go on. I do want to start with one question of my own, which comes up both in your remarks, but also in the documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. And this is the interaction between Nazi policy and American responses, which I think in the documentary, Ken Burns, Len Novak, they sort of make an effort to go back and forth to see that. And you've also shown this as well. But I think it's quite fascinating to think about how you have this refugee crisis, and you also see the sort of the futile, the toothless, the powerless response of an Evian conference, which is after the Anschluss, after the annexation of Austria and the growing refugee crisis, which really comes up with no solutions. And then, the crisis in Mansion and a failure to respond to it. And then even after Kristallnacht, Hitler essentially laughs at the world and says, in his famous speech of January 1939, they're oozing with sympathy for the Jews, but they're doing nothing to help them. So can you say a little something about how you think that interplay works? I mean, both in the way that it's presented in the documentary, but also in your research, the degree to which the Nazis, from your perspective, are attuned to the American response or lack of response, and how that informs some of their policies.
Yeah, I think the Nazis are attuned to what's going on in the United States in multiple ways. And I'd be interested, Avi, to hear what you think of this also, though, because I don't always know that it changes Nazi policy. So in the documentary, for example, they linger for a while on the Nazi response to Jim Crow America. Right, that we have a segregated United States. And if you look at, say, take some of the earliest measures that the Nazis put in place against Jews, right, 1933, 1934, 1935, Jewish doctors can't treat non-Jewish patients, right? Jewish lawyers can't represent non-Jewish clients. Jews can't belong to certain athletic clubs, right, or social clubs. Jews can't sit in certain benches in a park, right, in public facilities. That actually does look a lot like Jim Crow America in many ways, right? But and the Nazis in their propaganda will play on that at times. Peter Hayes talks about this in the film. The Holocaust historian Peter Hayes says, you know, the Nazis pointed to Mississippi, right? And that is true. But I think there's also a danger in overplaying that. You know, did the Nazi propaganda machine make hay out of the fact that there was segregation in America? Yes. Did it change their policy? I don't know that you could argue that. Now, when you get to 1938, it's pretty interesting. You mentioned the Evian conference, which I didn't mention, and I probably should have. You know, FDR calls an international conference to respond to the refugee crisis in the spring of 1938. So it's before Kristallnacht, but it's after the Nazis have annexed Austria, and that's really his response to. And it's no small thing for a president to call an international conference about the refugee problem, and 32 nations gather in Evian, France. But what FDR is really trying to do is get someone else, get some other nation to address this problem so that the United States doesn't have to. And nation after nation, representative of nation after nation, stands up and says, this is a horrible problem. This refugee problem is a horrible problem, but we can't take any refugees right now. And some will cite the economy, but some will spout anti-Semitic rhetoric. Some say we don't have a Jewish problem and we don't want to import one. You know, the international response, as to your term, is toothless, and then Hitler capitalizes on that and says, look, these countries don't want the Jews either. So the Nazi policy is a progressive step-by-step policy towards genocide, and Americans' lack of response is important as Nazis continue to push and push and push and see what they can get away with. And they learn over time. You know, when the Nazis come into power, they imagine a Judenrein Germany, right? A Germany free of Jews. They don't have a policy for mass murder yet, but what they learn over time is that no one's going to take the Jews. I think the way the film toggles back and forth between what's happening in Europe and happening in the United States is really important, and gives us a different view of the United States. And let me just take one more moment that's well beyond our time frame, but take D-Day, right? June 6th, 1944, right? A key turning point in the war. American Allied troops land in France, right? At Normandy. Think about how far Normandy is from German-occupied Poland. And it's a turning point in the war. June 6, 1944 is a key turning point in the war. June 6, 1944 is so late in the Holocaust. More than 5 million Jews are dead by June 6th of 1944, right? So what the series does, and what we try to do in the exhibition and the reader, by putting the timelines of the Holocaust and the war together, also gives you a different view, I hope, on American response.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And as you suggest, I mean, there is room for a much stronger American response, which obviously could have saved life, but also certainly would have, I think, influenced Nazi policy in certain ways. And this is where it's important for us not to view history retrospectively, to say, oh, well, this would have happened and there was nothing that we could have done. No, there are many contingencies at play here, which, I mean, hopefully the reason we study this is that it will influence future policy and how we respond to other crises and catastrophes and think about how better to respond.
Right.
I'm going to try to gather together. There's so many interesting questions coming in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'm going to try to gather them together and combine a few questions, if that's okay with you. There's a number of questions which are asking about, let's say, American public opinion, and trying to sort of parse, maybe dig a little bit deeper into the data that you presented about American public opinion. You talked about the difference between sort of information and belief. And so Tsipora, for example, asks, do we have any sense for how much of this information were everyday Americans actually absorbing from the news articles? Jay, who's a student in my class, thank you, Jay, asks, was there any difference in reactions between Democrats and Republicans? Do you have any data on sort of the ways in which, to dig into American public opinion, north, south, east, west, urban, rural, Democrat, Republican, sort of how this presents itself? And I'll just ask one other that connects to public opinion. Bailey, also a student in my class, thank you, Bailey, asks for, were there any prominent figures in America, political figures, celebrities, that showed public support, and how might that have influenced public opinion? So let's take those three questions about public opinion together.
Yeah. So public opinion polls are a very new thing in the 1930s. George Gallup, who runs the Gallup organization, gets Gallup going in the mid 1930s. These are very, very early public opinion polls. They're not nearly as sophisticated. I mean, I don't always know if we should trust the polls today, but even the data is not as sophisticated as what we would have today, and harder to parse. So we don't know as much as we would like to know, say, about regional differences or political differences in these public opinion polls. We, in putting together the exhibition, actually did a lot of work with the Gallup organization today. But the data that you would want to be there, and the data that we're used to seeing today, age, race, region, political affiliation, just doesn't exist to the same level of specificity, which is frustrating, I would say. The belief question is a much harder one to get at. Reception of information, I think, is always harder to quantify than the distribution of information, right? We can count newspaper articles, right? But I will say that Americans, I think there's a tone in a lot of the coverage that actually harkens back to World War I. There were many atrocity stories that circulated during World War I in the late 19-teens that turned out to be false. And so Americans are sometimes disinclined to believe some of these atrocity stories, and sometimes cite the false atrocity stories from World War I that had circulated. Also, once we get further on, even when the United States is reporting, even when American papers are reporting on genocide, right, 1942, 43, 44, we don't have reporters on the ground. We're getting, right, in German occupied Poland, the information is coming secondhand. So there is a tone when you read these newspaper articles very closely. There's a tone like, or a verbiage like, we've been told that, or it has been said that Jews are being deported. Now, does that matter for readers? It might. That might matter for very careful readers. I think one other thing that's really, really critical, especially, and I was talking about the 1930s today, but when we get to the 1940s and the reporting on genocide, which is happening in the United States in the 1940s, there's almost no visual evidence, and I think that really matters. So that when Americans start to see visual evidence of the atrocities that we know today, when we think about the Holocaust, Americans don't really start to see that until April or May of 1945, as the war is ending and as U.S. troops are encountering concentration camps. It's really one moment that I think about all the time is, General Eisenhower is with troops in Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald in Germany in April of 1945. He walks into Ohrdruf in early April, and one of the first things he reports back to General Marshall in the United States, he says, everything that we've read today to date has been an understatement. So there's a huge amount of information, but until Americans see it, I think they have trouble believing it. Then there was a question about celebrity culture. There's a lot of ways to answer that. I could have talked much more about Jewish organizations that stand up against Nazism, and there are Jewish organizations that do great work, like HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, an organization that no longer exists called the German Jewish Children's Aid, which is trying to bring in children. Non-Jewish organizations like the American Friends Service Committee do a great deal on behalf of refugees. There are some Hollywood stars whose names are forgotten today, probably by a lot of people, who do try to raise awareness about refugees. People like Edward G. Robinson, who's the star of a film called Confessions of a Nazi Spy, one of the first films in 1939 to take on Nazism. Charlie Chaplin's film in 1940, The Great Dictator. There are celebrities who stand up against Nazism. There are major celebrities who also, like Charles Lindbergh, who join America First and become loud mouthpieces for anti-Semitism in the United States as well. So you see influential Americans on both sides.
Thank you. And actually, there was a question that came in about the response of American Jewish organizations from my colleague Sebastian Vogenstein. Who, it's interesting. I mean, you alluded to some of the ways in which American Jewish groups responded, but Sebastian's question, asks if was the American Jewish community united in trying to support the acceptance of refugees? And I will say, the documentary tries to cover a lot, but one of the things that it does not cover to a great extent is American Jewish responses and the diverse nature. So maybe just say a little bit something about sort of the lack of unity in terms of how American Jews responded. Yeah,
I think there's two. I think about this in two ways, and one of the ways really struck me as I was working on the exhibition. So there are from 1933, from that moment where Hitler rises to power, there are some Jewish leaders like Rabbi Stephen Wise, who's a leading Reform rabbi in New York, who wants to take to the streets. Right, let's have protests. Let's have rallies. There are anti-Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden. There are marches in every northern city with any sizable Jewish population in 1933. There's an effort to boycott German-made goods in 1933. And then there are other Jewish leaders who are, of course, still anti-Nazi, but they want to use different tactics. They want to argue quietly behind the scenes to try to change American policy. And they tend to get a bad rap these days. And in some ways I understand that, but I think we have to remember that they are operating in an environment of heightened American anti-Semitism, and they're worried about a backlash of even more anti-Semitism. And in fact, sometimes they are threatened with a backlash of anti-Semitism. When Charles Lindbergh speaks out in 1941 for America First, he says, of course, Jews are anti-Nazi, but if we go to war for this Jewish cause, there will be a backlash. He basically threatens Jews in the United States. So that fear we have to keep that fear of anti-Semitic backlash in mind, excuse me. And then the other divide in American Jews, I think, is really important, which is, did you still have relatives in Europe or not? How long had your family been in the United States? And one of the documents that we include in the reader is a letter from a 10-year-old boy in 1942 who was at the Flatbush Yeshiva. He was a student at the Flatbush Yeshiva, and his entire class wrote letters to President Roosevelt, asking President Roosevelt in 1942 to stop, in his words, a 10-year-old writing, cold-blooded extermination of the Jews. Now, this is an individual who I have had the good fortune to get to know pretty well. He's 90 years old now. And I asked him about writing that letter. And I said, what did you know? He said, well, look, my whole class wrote the letters. And I said, yeah, but how did you know as a 10-year-old? And he said, of course we knew as 10-year-olds, the rabbis were crying all day at the yeshiva, right? It was their relatives who were still there, right? Who you were trying to get out, right? And I do think that's a different level of urgency and a different level of awareness than many American Jews who wanted to support Jews around the world, but it might not have been their cousin, right, in Poland who they were trying to get out, or their parents, right? And that's a divide also among the urgency for some American Jews. Daniel Mendelsohn talks about this beautifully in the film, and his book, The Lost, really gets at this in such a deep, dramatic way. So it depends how close you were as a Jewish person in America to Jews in Europe, how well you knew them, and were they your family?
Yeah, interesting. As you suggest, there's the immediacy of, on the one hand, seeing is believing, and then also how close one feels and the distancing that might allow people to sort of disapprove, as one of our commenters says, disapprove of the violence, but not sort of have it register on a personal or meaningful level to motivate them to take any action.
Right. Right.
Let's, if you're okay, we'll do a couple more questions. Yeah.
Sure. Sure.
So I'm going to group a few that that let's say are in the rescue category, asking a little bit about sort of what American organizations did to rescue or did not do to rescue. And one of them comes from Ron and Renata Cadden, who ask about the role of the State Department in the lack of response, both in terms of admitting refugees and sort of that we could see this in the documentary, the very callous nature of our immigration policy, also as you talked about. But we also have a few questions about the work of the War Refugee Board,
Great.
Which Rebecca Erbelding, who's, her work on the War Refugee Board, which for those who are not familiar with it, I'd highly recommend that book as a sort of very comprehensive history of the role of the War Refugee Board. But also, if you can say a little bit about sort of the work that the War Refugee Board does to aid Jews in Europe during the war. Yeah. And then, sorry to group so many together, Danny. I'm just trying to get to as many as possible. There's a couple of questions about rescue, again, specifically, which both have to do with knowledge. So, Lydia asks about the Regner telegram, and if, first of all, if the United States had taken immediate action after first learning about genocide, as detailed in the Regner telegram, what, as you suggest, what could the U.S. have done on a practical level at that moment in time? And as the Regner telegram comes in August of 42, and the deportations are happening from Warsaw to Treblinka. I mean, it's the deadliest year of the war, from 42 to 43. So on a practical level. And Stu, hi Stu, who's also a contributor to the volume Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust on using memorials to teach the Holocaust. Danny has an excellent chapter on using museums to teach the Holocaust. So Stu asks, while the rescue of European Jews became more challenging once we became a belligerent in the war, and once the events of the Holocaust became well known in 1942, didn't the US still struggle with saving Jewish lives even when it might have been accomplished without having an impact on the war effort? So similarly, right, that knowledge, what could, so sorry to group all those together, but State Department, War Refugee Board, and knowledge that comes with the Regner telegram, what rescue could have been undertaken at that time?
Okay, I'll try to cover that and remind me if I skip things. So the State Department and the War Refugee Board are intimately tied. So I'll take those two first. The State Department is really the most patrician, old school branch of the U.S. government at this time. There's an anti-Semitic culture in the State Department at the time, and really embodied in a man named Breckinridge Long, who is highlighted in the documentary and has control over the visa division. So it's the State Department that issues visas You go to a consulate in Europe and you try to get a visa, you meet a representative, a consul from the State Department there. And it's, at least until 1941, it's at that person's discretion about whether or not, if you have your paperwork lined up and you have a sponsor and you've jumped through all the really bureaucratic, maddeningly bureaucratic hoops, it's still at the discretion of that consul of whether you get a visa or not. And so the consuls in various cities behave very differently. We have some consuls who really stretch to try to issue visas and some who don't. Breckinridge Long, very publicly by 1940 and 1941, is using a rhetoric about national security to try to gin up fear of that immigrants will be a threat to national security. That's what he's saying publicly. If you read his diary privately, it is some of the most vitriolic anti-Semitism of the day, right? The State Department then, as the United States enters the war, starts to actively block information about the threat to Europe's Jews from making it to their intended recipients. And by 1943, the Treasury Department has discovered this. Young attorneys in the Treasury Department, they take it to the head of the Treasury Department, Henry Morgenthau, who is an old friend of FDR's, the only Jewish person in the cabinet. And this is all covered in Rebecca Erbelding's really excellent book that Avi cited called Rescue Board. They take this to FDR by 1944, early 1944, this information that the State Department is being obstructionist. And FDR issues an executive order to create a body called the War Refugee Board. It's an intergovernmental agency among the State Department, War Department, and Treasury. And their task, their charge, is to rescue Jews as long as it doesn't impede the war effort. And if you read Rebecca's book, you'll see just remarkable work by the head of the War Refugee Board, a man named John Paley, and the group that works around him in the War Refugee Board. They work legally and they work extra legally from within the United States government to try to rescue Jews. It's a matter of debate how many they rescue, but it's tens of thousands for sure. It's probably in the area of maybe 125,000 or so. They work closely with Raoul Wallenberg, which might be a name that you know, right? Who issues, forged visa documents, for example, right? So they're doing anything that they can to rescue Jews. They bring over to the United States in August of 1944 nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees to Oswego, New York, to a military, to Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York. They don't admit them as refugees, but they hold them there as really goods at a free port. That's the only time in this history where the United States lets in a mass of immigrants outside of the restrictive immigration policy, only in August of 1944, and it's very much at the behest of the War Refugee Board. So they do great work. It's a story in and of itself, and it's a story that's focused on also a lot in the third episode of the film. The Regner cable is information that makes it to the World Jewish Congress in August of 1944, as Avi said, about the Nazis' plan to murder all the Jews of Europe. We don't have all the details, but if you think about the outline, the big story is Jews are being concentrated in ghettos to be deported east for mass murder in killing centers. That information has made it to the State Department by August of 1942. The State Department blocks that from getting to the American public, but only for a few months. And by November of 1942, it's public information in America. Again, not all the details are right, but the story is there. Again, so to get to that question of what could the United States have done at that time, militarily, not very much. 1942 is when the US military, November of 1942 is when we're just landing troops in North Africa. The first year of the war after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 is very much focused on the Pacific. We don't get troops into North Africa until November of 1942. In 1943, as the killing is at its height, they're still trying to make their way up the boot of Italy. We're very, very far from German-occupied Poland, right, where the killing is happening. So while we would like to believe that the United States military could have done anything it wanted, it was a very, very limited military. When we go to war, we have the 17th largest military in the world. So we were, and again, by the time D-Day comes around, 5 million Jews are dead. What could we have done? We could have put more pressure on governments that were allied with the Nazis. But militarily, we have very few options in November of 1942. We're just trying to make it across North Africa and into Italy. By 1944, we had many more options, right? And we certainly could have flown missions to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz or to bomb the crematoria at Auschwitz. Historians used to debate, was that possible or not? By the second half of 1944, it's absolutely possible. But again, that's very, very late in the killing process. And the United States doesn't choose to do that. And that's not an anomaly. That's very consistent with our understanding of the war. FDR's administration believed that you stop the killing by stopping the killers. And any effort, that means defeating the Nazis, any effort and proposal for humanitarian aims was seen by Roosevelt's administration as a diversion from the war effort. And that can leave us today with a lot of moral outrage, which I understand, that moral outrage. But when you look at the evidence, the War Department saying, no, we're not going to bomb Auschwitz because that's not a war aim, that's entirely consistent with how the United States views war aims all the way along.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one final question, which is sort of a big picture question. And it was a question that came in earlier. I'm not sure if Larry is still here with us, but he asked about, I think a question that alludes to anti-Semitism in America today. And clearly you show sort of the very deep roots that long precede World War II and the Holocaust, and the very deep roots in sort of American, American anti-Semitism and nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment, and sort of the broad swaths of American society that are anti-Semitic at this time and how it influences policy. So of course, inevitably, many people who are listening to us tonight see what's happening in the U.S. right now. I saw a survey that said that survey of American Jewish voters from this week, that something like 85 to 90% expressed their deep alarm over the, even over 90%, right? Sort of a consensus over the deep alarm over the shocking uptick in anti-Semitism in America. But I guess one of the things that comes through in your remarks this evening is perhaps it's not shocking to see this. And so I do want to ask sort of what connections you think we can make between what you've shown us from America in the 1920s and 30s and America now in the 2020s, what we should take away, and perhaps with an allusion to also how they present it in the film, which I think very dramatically in the final episode fast forward to the present day. Right. What do you think about those connections?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ken Burns and Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein, the directors of the film, are deeply worried about the future of democracy, right? And they wanted to make a connection to the future of democracy. It's, if we were sitting here on the 74th anniversary of Kristallnacht instead of the 84th anniversary of Kristallnacht and said that things like Charlottesville were coming, or the Tree of Life Synagogue, right? I think that would have been unimaginable to a lot of people then. The resuscitation of Nazi symbols in American life, in American public life, is deeply, deeply troubling. And I think even to me, I don't know if you would say this too obvious, but as someone who studies this, 10 years ago, I think would have been unimaginable, right? So, the dam has broken on that in a way that is really troubling. I have to believe deeply in education, right, as a way to try to combat this, and not only Holocaust education. Holocaust education is not the only way to combat anti-Semitism. There's a lot of other ways to combat anti-Semitism, but one of the things that strikes me about anti-Semitism is how it contains its own contradictions, right? And I talk about this in the film, right? Jews are communists, Jews are capitalists, right? I mean, these are contradictory ideologies, and so there's no logic to prejudice. So how do you fight prejudice with logic? That's something that I really struggle with, and I guess one other thing I'll leave you with. I've cited Peter Hayes a lot this evening, but Peter Hayes, who's a colleague of mine at Northwestern, has a fantastic book on understanding the Holocaust. It's called Why? Understanding the Holocaust. And one of the lessons that Peter writes at the end of that book is beware the beginnings. But how do you know when it's the beginnings? You can't live your life as if every moment is the beginning of fascism, right? And that's something that I still really kind of wrestle with today. That notion, Jews in 1933 in Germany said, this is awful, but it can't get worse, right? This is unimaginable. To me, one of the lessons of the Holocaust is anything unimaginable actually can happen. Now, I'm not saying you have to that we should all live our lives as if anti-Semitism is going to lead again to mass murder. But I do think there were ways that professions failed in Germany. Judges failed in Germany early on. The business community failed in Germany early on to stand up to fascism. And when we see assaults on democracy, we have to stand up to it, not in a kind of Chicken Little, the sky is falling way, but a way where we are aware that it's early on that ideas like this have to be combated.
Well, Danny, thank you. It's a difficult message to have to hear and to absorb, but it's also a call for all of us to protect and defend the ideals of the democracy and to speak out against hate speech and to be aware and to be concerned, but also to know that there are steps and actions that we can take in the form of education and also in putting in safeguards to protect our democracy. And also, I think to regulate, unchecked hate speech and all sorts of fora that needs to be. We need to protect many who are vulnerable from hearing things that they shouldn't be hearing. So, right. I think it's a profound, moment for us to consider what we have to do to protect our democracy and to join together with all groups to defend against racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia and all forms of prejudice and hatred. So I want to thank you so much for being here with us this evening. Let's have one more virtual round of applause.
Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, thank you. We owe you an in-person experience here in Connecticut, but thanks for joining us virtually. And some have asked, this program has been recorded and will be posted to the UConn Center for Judaic Studies YouTube channel, and we're happy to share it with those of you who are in attendance. Thank you again to Danny Greene. Thank you to everyone for joining us here this evening, and I wish everyone a safe and happy and healthy New Year to come. Everybody be well. Thank you so much.